So, hello and welcome to a special edition of Conscious TV with me, Iain McNay. I'm going to talk you through a new book, actually it's two books that we've released fairly recently with transcripts of our interviews. And just to remind you, in the past we did a book several years ago called Conversations on Non-Duality, which did really well with 26 transcripts of different interviews. And we followed that with Conversations on the Enneagram, which for those of you who know about the Enneagram, it's a fascinating tool for looking at your personality. And these two now, it was going to be one book, but it's now two books because there was too many for one book. Conversations on Awakening, part 1 and part 2. And we cover some of the more interesting interviews we feel we've done over the last few years. And there's something about reading a transcript which makes it so much more interesting than just looking at the person on the screen. It might be a strange thing to say that, but I always find that actually reading something, for me anyway, it tends to go in more deeply. And of course, if you're not quite sure about exactly what somebody said, you can look back and read it again. Whereas on the video, you certainly get the feel of the person and you get a context and you see what they look like. But in terms of a book, you actually get the text there, which you can read several times. And you can obviously just nip in and read bits and pieces. Anyway, I wanted just to talk to you about some of the interviews that have particularly affected me. And if I start with part 2, this one. And I start at the index here at the front. I look at the name Wamble. Well, Wamble is a musician that I've known for a time now, and he was originally in a band called Public Image. He was the bass player in a band called Public Image, which was John Lydon's band. He started when he left the Sex Pistols. And they were a very influential band, and John had a kind of upbringing in North London, very working class upbringing, quite violent at times, very much a drinking culture. And it was amazing really because John Lydon invited him to join Public Image. And Joe Wamble had never actually played in a band before. He played bass guitar a bit. And the first song that he recorded, Public Image Limited, for those of you who know that song, he played that amazing bass line that starts the song. Anyway, John's life took on a completely different turn in the band. There was the tours, there was obviously all the excesses that goes with that kind of life, or can go with that kind of life on the road. And he ended up in a bit of a pickle, really. He did start his own band, which went fairly well, had a couple of minor hits. But he reached a point where he couldn't really go on anymore, and he thought about suicide. He was drinking too much, drugging too much. It was very much an over-the-top lifestyle he had. And then one day, he decided to clean up his life. And he found meditation and Qigong. He got remarried to a Chinese woman, and his life completely changed. And now we're good friends now, John and I go, I say John because his real name is John Wardle, but his stage name is Wamble. Wamble was a name given to him by actually Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols, who isn't with us anymore because he didn't change his life. But anyway, John is a gentle giant now, and I see him every now and again, and his discipline, his practice of meditation and Qigong and awareness carries him through life. And he's a transformed person. And he says right at the end of the interview, I have to admit I'm a born-again Buddhist now. And that's how he sees himself. And then there's Martin Wilson. Now Martin Wilson works, and I think still works, as a caretaker in a school. And he had a situation where he was married to a woman called Marie. In fact, he still is married to a woman called Marie. And he got to the point where he thought his marriage was in trouble because she was heavily into spiritual adventure. And she was going to lots of workshops, reading lots of books on spiritual matters, meditation and mindfulness and all kinds of various spiritual books. And he thought, oh dear, this is not good. And she was changing and he wasn't changing, and there was some friction in the marriage. So he decided that he was going to debunk what she was doing. He was going to show to her as her husband that what she was doing was nonsense. So he started to read a lot of the books that she read. He even went to some of the workshops that she went to. He watched some of the videos that she watched. And in the end, he realized it was having a big effect on him. And there was something was changing in him. His life was getting better in one way. And he devised, which he talks about in the interview, he devised this meditation of his own, which was watching fish swim in a tank. It sounds very simplistic, as I just mentioned it here, but actually for him it was very deep, and he started to see more the truth of who he really was. And in the end, when he was embarrassed to tell Maria all this, and in the end, when he told her, she couldn't believe it, because he had actually, in his own way, found out more who he was than she had on her journey. That isn't to say that what she wasn't doing wasn't the right thing for her. We all have individual journeys. But again, it fascinated me, and actually bring Maria in for the latter part of the interview, and they're now very happily married, and he still works as a caretaker. And then there's Jurgen Zetterberg. I think I pronounced that right. Jurgen is, as you would guess, he's German. He wrote several books, and he has been on a journey spiritually for a long, long time, really committed. And he wrote one book called 10 Minute Moment, which I read and I loved. And it was just based over a week of his life. He rented a cabin in a quite remote part of the Scottish Highlands, and he had for a week. He had no outside stimulants. He lived very simply. He just cooked his own food, although he didn't eat much because he had to take it all with him. He sat on a beanbag and slept on a very basic bed, and there was no heating or anything, and I think an outside toilet. And he diarised that whole week very intently. He went for a walk every day. He was very keen on photography, took lots of photographs, and for him, something extraordinary happened. He had one of those moments. In fact, he had a 10-minute moment where he saw reality completely differently. And since then, he's basically been free. And that's his story of his week in the Scottish Highlands. And then there's Russell Williams. Russell Williams was the oldest person I've ever interviewed. He was 95 years old when I interviewed him. We had to go up to Manchester because he was not really that fit to travel. And I interviewed him in a cramped room in Manchester Buddhist Centre on the outskirts of Manchester. And it was crowded because there was lots of other people in the room that were part of the Buddhist group. And wow, he lived a life. He came from a poor family. Both his parents had died by the time he was 12 years old. And so he had to look after his sister. He had to leave school and work at 12 and look after his sister. And he had a tough time. And he tells lots of fascinating stories about how he first saw an elephant. Well, the elephant came into Tilbury Docks and it walked along the road to a zoo. That's how they got the elephant there. They didn't have a vehicle to take the elephant there. And so you just see how life was so different. And we're only talking about 80, 90 years ago. Completely different life was. And then he, in the war, he was involved with the evacuation of Dunkirk. He went out in some small boats and helped people to evacuate the troops that were stuck there. And then when he came back from the war, he had nothing. Had nowhere to live. He had no money. So he just wandered around from place to place getting odd jobs and just sleeping where he could. So he'd get a job on a farm for a few weeks, and then maybe get a job in a factory somewhere else for a few weeks. And he was just wandering around England. And he was okay, but then someone said, they're looking for someone to work in a circus. And his eyes, everything lit up. Working in a circus, he felt drawn. And then he had to travel for several days walking to find the circus. And when he was at the circus, he worked with the horses. And he got to love the horses. And he knew the horses so well. And after 3 years, there was a time when he looked into a horse's eyes, and he was the horse. He was himself, he was the horse, and he was everything. He didn't know what had happened to him. He had no idea. He didn't know about spiritual things. He'd never read a spiritual book. But he did manage to find somebody later who did understand what had happened to him and helped him to just assimilate the experience, understand it more. And he's died now, he's left us now. But at the time of me doing the interview with him, he was still doing the occasional lecture at the Buddhist Centre in Manchester. And someone, Steve Taylor, who's quite well known in spiritual circles, had written a book all about Russell. And then also I'm leaving out the ones Renata has done, the interviews she's done. She will talk about those another time. And I'm looking up here and I'm getting to Deborah Wilkinson. Well, Deborah had a really tough time, English woman who now lives in Spain, and she had just tremendous fear and anxiety, crippling. It's almost as if she couldn't function. And she got to the point of complete desperation. And then she read a book about meditation. And she went into meditation thinking, this is my only chance. So she meditated for hours, I think it was 8 hours a day after day after day. And I should have mentioned also, she had tremendous physical pain in her body as well. And she just sat, and she sat with the pain, she sat with the fear. She was completely committed because she felt there was no other way for her. And that's something that comes up frequently. People either change through desperation or inspiration. In her case, it was desperation. But the inspiration came because she found the peace. She found the place that exists behind all thought, behind everything. The place that's always there. It's been called the peace that passes all understanding. People have different names for it, that's not important. But through her commitment, she found it, and she's free. And when she wrote me a letter to say that she was interested in being interviewed on Conscious TV, she said, I am awake and ready. And she actually wrote a real letter. I'm awake and ready. I couldn't resist interviewing her. So that's some of the, I won't say highlights, they're all highlights, but some of the interviews that I did from the second book. The first book, there's Phillip Jacobs. Phillip Jacobs is a very lovely man. He's been ill most of his life. He's had Lyme disease, and Lyme disease can be very crippling. And he didn't know what it was to start with. He had a normal childhood that any kid does and loved the outdoors. And then he started to lose his energy, had a lot of pain. His brain didn't work so well. And he found it tough, really tough. But then he read some books. He found a centre in London where there was spiritual practice. I should have actually read the interview beforehand. I forgot the name of who his teacher was, but he had a well-known teacher. And he started to change, and he started to be able to accept it. It isn't really accept the illness, but it's almost as if he could include his physical pain which he had, the tiredness he had in his life, and he saw he wasn't a victim. He saw this was part of his journey in his life. And what he was doing the first time I met him, he was leading a group of whirling dervishes in West London. He was I think they call it the master of the group, which was an incredible experience. And they still have that. If you Google whirling dervishes in West London, you'll find them. Except I just remembered it. The building's called the Study Society, where they have them. So he tells his story, and he now his big hobby is collecting fossils. He's well enough to do that now, some of the time anyway. He goes along the Dorset coast finding fossils. And then there's John Butler. Now, John Butler had written 2 or 3 books. Someone recommended him to Conscious TV, and he wouldn't come to London. He said he was too old to come to London. I think he was 77, 78, which isn't that old, but he didn't want to come to London. But I talked to him on the phone a couple of times, and I read his books, and I thought, here's a man I want to interview. So I went with the crew to a place called, I forgot the name of the place, but it's in the Midlands. It'll come to me in a minute. I didn't make any notes for this, I should have done. It's near Burton. It's near Burton-on-Trent in the Midlands. And when I got there, it was a very hot evening. We got there evening, we drove up. And he suggested we do the interview in his flat, which wasn't a great environment. And then he was saying, well, I do meditate in my local church for 3 hours every morning and 2 hours every afternoon, late afternoon, 5 hours a day. He just sits and meditates. So we went to look at the church, and then I decided that's the place to do the interview. And so the following morning we went to the church. John had done his meditation from, I think it's 5 to 8. He meditates in the morning. And we did the interview. We did 2 parts in the end. And it was a very special atmosphere in that church. And it was a very special interview because John, again, hasn't had an easy life. He's travelled a lot in his life. He's been around the world many times. He was a farmer. He had a special relationship with his animals. He lived in Russia for a time because his mother was Russian, and actually he has a Russian wife. And again, over time, something really happened to John. He's as I said, he's an intense meditator. He just sits and watches, and he's just there. And really, that's all we have to do, is just sit and watch. But we have to get to the point in life where we feel we want to do that. I'm keeping John's story short. It's actually quite a long story because he had so many amazing experiences. But anyway, that's covered in the book. And it's always interesting with Conscious TV because when we do an interview, we don't really know how well it will do. We know if the person has a profile, i.e. they've written a few, I won't say best-selling, but a few books that have sold quite well, then we'll get more views. But with John, his books hadn't sold, as far as I know it, very well at all. He didn't do any meetings or seminars or anything, so he wasn't really known. And when the interviews went up, they were a bit slow to start with, and they took off. And now part 1 has got 1.8 million views, and part 2 has got several 100,000. So there's something about John that isn't just him. People find his voice very calming. And there's something called ASMR, which I don't even know what it stands for. But people find ASMR very supportive if they need to relax or they can't sleep. And there's another site that's reloaded my interview with John part 1 that's had 2.6 million views. And that's people not necessarily interested in his spiritual journey, but using his voice because they find it relaxes them. And I'll just mention 2 other interviews briefly from this part 1, which is the school the school that Renata and I were in for many, many years was the Ridwan School, run by A.H. Almas. And I interviewed him. That was in Holland, Amsterdam, a few years ago. And that's very much again about his story and what happened with him, and how he's from Kuwait, and how he studied to be a physicist. And he wanted to know what the truth was. He wanted to know what was behind the facade of reality as we know it. And as a physicist, he got to see more and more that everything we see isn't necessarily real. He wanted to find the truth. And he got very involved with Claudio Narango, who I also interviewed on Conscious TV, whose interview is transcribed here, who had a book, and a group called Seeker After Truth. And Claudia's no longer with us either. And the more that Hamid, I call him Hamid, A.H. Almas, his real name is Hamid Ali, A.H. Almas is his pen name for writing. The more Hamid found out about life, the more he found the importance of presence, of understanding presence. And he has a whole school called the Diamond Heart School, which you may have heard of, which I say Renata and I have been in for many, many years. And again, that's not only a fascinating story, but it has many, many insights. And really, with Conscious TV, what we always encourage people, it's not, of course, just about the story. It's not just about their realization. It's the integration of living. That realization, that's the important thing. If you don't integrate it, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just another experience on the way. And the last one I'll mention from part one is Jessica Britt. And Jessica was actually one of our teachers that we met with regularly in the Ridwan School. So that's the school of A.H. Almas. And Jessica's a wonderful woman. She has more of a Sufi background, but of course works in the Diamond Heart School. And that's the great thing about this school. I'm not plugging the school particularly, but the teachers all come from different backgrounds, and they all have their own way that they've found their own freedom. And that's really what these two books are about. It's all these different paths, all these different journeys, all these different adventures about how to find who we really are, how to find the truth for us. And there's many paths up the mountain, and every path is valid, every path is different. And when you get to the top of the mountain, of course, we all have the same view. And I'll finish there. And thank you for listening to this. I hope you enjoy the books if you get the books. If not, you can watch the interviews. And I'll talk to you again soon. Goodbye.